In February of 1839, a woman walked across the frozen Mississippi River, carrying 2 children and leading 2 more by the hand. She was 34 years old. Her husband was in a jail in Missouri, and she did not know whether he was alive. The state she was leaving had issued an order that people of her faith should be driven out or exterminated, and it was signed by a governor. And under her skirts, sewn into bags tied around her waist, she was carrying paper, hundreds of pages of a manuscript her husband had been working on for years. She had decided, on a night when she had to choose what her body could carry, that the paper came too. Her name was Emma Hale Smith, and I think she is the most flattened person in our entire history. Flattened is the word I keep coming back to, because for 180 years, Emma has mostly been used rather than known. One side made her a saint who never wavered, which required leaving out most of what she actually said. The other side made her the wife who left, the proof that the whole thing was rotten, which required leaving out the 49 years she spent insisting it was true. Both versions are thinner than the woman, and the real one is harder, sadder, and considerably more interesting than either. I want to tell you about her tonight, not the argument about her. Her. If you have only ever heard Emma's name used as ammunition by somebody, you are exactly who this channel is for. The subscribe button helps more than you would think at this size. We spent 5 parts on Joseph. This one belongs beside them, and I would argue it should have come first, because you cannot understand the man without the woman who was standing next to him for every single thing that happened. Let's start on a farm in Pennsylvania. Emma Hale was born on the 10th of July, 1804, in a place called Willingsboro that later took the name Harmony. She was the 7th of 9 children born to Isaac and Elizabeth Hale, and the family was not poor. They had a farm of about 90 acres in the Susquehanna River Valley, and Isaac ran a shipping business alongside it. This matters because the story people tell in their heads usually has Joseph Smith marrying a farm girl with no options. That is not who she was. She went to Methodist services from the time she was 7. She very likely attended a female seminary in Great Bend Township, which was real education for a woman in that decade. She taught school. Emma Hale had choices. Keep that in your mind the whole way through, because almost every decision she made after this cost her something, and she made all of them as a person who could have done otherwise. Joseph came into it in late October of 1825. He was 19, she was 21, and older than him, which nobody ever mentions. He had come down from New York looking for work, and the work he had found was with a man named Josiah Stowell, who was digging for a rumored Spanish silver mine. I'm going to be honest about that rather than hurry past it, because this is the part where a faithful telling usually gets vague. Joseph Smith was employed, at the time Emma met him, in treasure seeking. Her father knew it. Her father hated it. Isaac Hale thought his daughter was being courted by a young man with no prospects and an unserious occupation. And if you take the religion out of it entirely, you can see exactly what Isaac Hale was looking at. Emma married him anyway. On the 18th of January, 1827, she left her father's house without his blessing and married Joseph Smith in South Bainbridge, New York. She eloped. At 22, educated, from a comfortable family against a father who had said no. That is the first thing she ever did in this story, and it tells you most of what you need to know about her. It also cost her. The rupture with the Hales never really healed, and when she moved to Fayette, New York in September of 1830 to live with the Whitmer family, she was cut off from her own people, more or less permanently. She was 26 years old, and she had traded her family for his. Now, the year before that, 1828, and the part of Emma's life that gets one sentence in most retellings. In the winter of 1828 and 1829, Emma worked as a scribe on the translation of the Book of Mormon. She was the only woman who ever did. Think about what that means physically. There was a curtain sometimes, and sometimes there was not. She sat at a table and wrote down words as her husband spoke them, hour after hour. And for a book that has since been printed something like 200 million times. Whatever you believe about where those words came from, she was the first person in the world to hear a great deal of them. And she said something about it decades later, at the very end of her life, that I find almost impossible to get around. She said the Book of Mormon was of divine authenticity, and that she had not the slightest doubt of it. That statement comes from a woman who, by that point, had every earthly reason to say the opposite. Hold on to it. We are going to need it at the end. But 1828 was not mainly the scribe year for Emma. It was the year her first child died. And the dates here are so close together that I had to check them 3 times, because when you lay them side by side, they stop looking like history and start looking like something out of a tragedy. Martin Harris had been scribing for Joseph in Harmony that spring. Harris wanted to take the completed pages home to show his family, and after a great deal of pleading, he was allowed to. He left with the manuscript on the 14th of June, 1828. Emma gave birth the next day, the 15th of June, a son. They named him Alvin. He died the same day, after a delivery so difficult that Emma herself nearly did not survive it, and for 2 weeks afterward, Joseph did not leave her side, because it was not clear that she would live. Then, when she was finally strong enough that he could go, he traveled to Palmyra to find out what had become of the pages. And the pages were gone. Those are the 116 pages, and they have never been recovered. Sit with the order of that. Emma buried her first child on a Sunday. She spent 2 weeks at the edge of her own life. And the moment she was well enough to be left alone, her husband went north and came back with the news that the manuscript she had helped write, the thing they had given up her family for, had been lost by a friend. Whatever you believe about this history, that is a brutal summer for a 23-year-old woman. And here is what she did next. When the translation resumed, she went back to the table and took up the pen again. I have to put a number next to that because it does not appear in the way we usually tell this history. Emma Smith gave birth to 9 children and adopted 2 more. 4 of them died at birth or within hours. 2 more died as toddlers. 6 children. She buried 6 children. And one of those stories is the single hardest thing I have read in the whole of this history. So I want to tell it properly, rather than let it sit inside a statistic. On the 30th of April, 1831, in Kirtland, Emma gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They lived a few hours. Within about a day, in Orange, Ohio, a woman named Julia Clapp Murdoch also gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She died later that same day. Her husband, John Murdoch, was left with newborn twins and no way to feed them. So he brought them to Joseph and Emma, who had held her own 2 babies that same week and buried them, took another woman's 2 babies to her chest and raised them as her own. They were named Joseph and Julia. I do not know what to do with that, except say it slowly. 2 mothers, 2 sets of twins, the same week, 1 town apart. One mother lost her children, the other lost her life. And the 4 surviving people in that arrangement were rearranged into a family by a man carrying 2 infants across Ohio to a house he knew was grieving. It gets worse, and I am sorry. But leaving this out is exactly the flattening I said I would not do. In March of 1832, at the John Johnson farm in Hiram, Ohio, a mob dragged Joseph out of the house in the night and tarred and feathered him. The baby, little Joseph Murdoch Smith, already had measles. In the commotion, the house was open to the March cold. He died a few days later, on the 29th of March, 1832. So Emma lost her own twins, was given 2 more, and then lost one of those to a mob that had come for her husband. She was 27. Julia lived. She was the first child in that family to reach adulthood, and she is buried in Nauvoo. She died in 1880, the year after Emma, at 49. When people ask why Emma Smith was, by some accounts, a hard woman in later life, guarded and unwilling to be moved, I would gently suggest the answer is not a character flaw. It is Kirtland and Hiram, and a row of small graves in 3 states. We talk about persecution in this history constantly, and we should. We talk about Liberty Jail and Haun's Mill and the extermination order. We very rarely say that the ordinary, private, non-persecutory grief in that house was already more than most people carry in a lifetime, and that it ran underneath every single public event we do talk about. When you read her letters, that is the thing sitting behind the handwriting. She was baptized on the 28th of June, 1830, at Colesville, New York, by Oliver Cowdery. It did not go smoothly. A crowd showed up and disrupted it. Her confirmation was delayed, and Joseph was arrested for disorderly conduct. Even the sacraments in this family arrived with a complication attached. Shortly after, Joseph received the revelation we now have as Section 25 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it is addressed to her directly. It calls her an elect lady. It tells her to be a scribe, to expound scriptures, to exhort the church, and to make a selection of sacred hymns. I want to pause on the last one, because it turned into the most underrated thing she ever did. In a period when men decided what a congregation sang, Emma Smith selected the hymns. She worked with William Phelps on selections that ran in church newspapers in 1832. And in 1835, in Kirtland, the first Latter-day Saint hymnbook was printed under her name. 1835. If you have ever sung anything in a chapel of this church, you are downstream of a decision Emma Hale Smith made about what her people should sing. That is not a small legacy. It is just a quiet one, and quiet legacies get flattened first. In Kirtland, she and Elizabeth Ann Whitney organized feasts for the poor. In Nauvoo, she filled her house with the sick and the orphaned and the homeless, to the point where it was less a home than an institution with a family living in it. Which brings us back to the ice. The extermination order came in the autumn of 1838. Joseph was taken and held in Missouri, and in February of 1839, Emma crossed the Mississippi with 4 children and those manuscript pages tied to her body. She wrote to Joseph in the jail the following month. I want to read you her own line, because it is better than anything I could say about her. She wrote that she still lived, and was yet willing to suffer more, if it was the will of kind heaven that she should, for his sake. He had written to her the year before that his heart was entwined around hers forever and ever. These are not two people in a political arrangement. Whatever else you are about to hear, start from the fact that these two loved each other, on paper, in their own handwriting, in the worst year of their lives. Nauvoo is where she reached the height of what she was. In March of 1842, the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo was organized, and Emma was its president, from its founding until 1844. She taught doctrine. She managed the membership. She defended moral purity in public and by name. She met visiting officials. She appeared beside Joseph at civic occasions. She carried petitions on behalf of the church into the political world. She was also the first woman to receive the temple ordinances, and she then administered them to other women. I want to say that plainly because of where we are about to go. At the moment the hardest part of this story begins, Emma Smith was not a bystander in this church. She was arguably the most significant woman in it, holding an office, teaching doctrine, and standing inside its most sacred rites. Everything I've told you so far, both sides agree on. What comes next is where the two stories split. Plural marriage. I am not going to skip this, I am not going to soften it, and I am not going to pretend the record is tidier than it is. If you want that version, there are 100 channels that will give it to you in either direction. Here is what the church's own published history says, and it is not comfortable. Joseph introduced plural marriage incrementally. He married additional women under agreements of confidentiality. Some of those marriages were for this life, some were sealings for eternity only. And some of them he did not tell Emma about at all. That last sentence is the one. Not the doctrine, the concealment. In early 1843, Emma appears to have accepted the practice. She personally witnessed and consented to Joseph's marriages to 4 women. Whatever it cost her, she stood there and said yes. By July of that same year, she had reversed completely. She burned a manuscript copy of the Revelation on plural marriage, the text we now have as section 132. 6 months. From consenting in person to putting the paper in the fire. And there are no documented additional marriages after the autumn of 1843. So let me give the hardest reading of that its full strength, because it deserves it, and because you have heard the soft version already. The hardest reading goes like this. A man in his late 30s who held total religious authority over his community married other women, some of them very young, some of them already married, and concealed a number of those marriages from his wife. When she found out, she was presented with a revelation that said in writing that she should accept it. She resisted. She burned it. And for the rest of her life she said it had never happened at all, which is either a lie or a wound so deep it rewrote her memory. That is the case. I am not going to caricature it, because a caricature would be easier to answer, and you would be right not to trust me afterward. What I will say is what the record actually supports and what it does not. It supports that Emma's experience of this was agony. Nobody argues otherwise. The Church's own account describes her position as reversing inside a matter of months, and burning a revelation is not the act of a woman at peace. It supports that concealment happened, and that concealment is the specific injury. A person can believe every doctrinal claim in this history and still say that keeping it from her was a wrong done to her. What the record does not support is the clean version either side wants. Emma did not quietly submit, so the saint story fails. And Emma did not leave, denounce it, and walk away, so the apostate story fails too. Because here is what she actually did in June of 1844, weeks before he died. She wrote that she desired with all her heart to honor and respect her husband as her head, to live in his confidence, and by acting in union with him, to keep the place God had given her by his side. That is a woman in an impossible position, choosing him again. Not because she had been broken into it. She had burned a revelation the year before. She was perfectly capable of refusing. I cannot make that simple for you. I do not think it was simple for her. He was killed on the 27th of June, 1844. She was pregnant with their last child. He died without a will, and the estate was a catastrophe, because for years Joseph had held church property and personal property in a tangle that nobody had ever unpicked, and now the man who understood it was dead. This is where Emma and Brigham Young break, and I want to be careful here, because this is the part most often told as a clash of personalities. It was mostly a clash of paperwork, and paperwork is what ruins families. Emma was a widow with children and no will. The church, led by the Quorum of the 12, needed to establish what belonged to the institution and what did not. Emma needed to establish what belonged to her children. Both were reasonable positions. Both were held by people who had just watched a man be murdered. And there were debts, and no clarity about who owed them. Steel man both sides for a second, because they are both defensible. From Brigham Young's side, a church that had been driven out of 2 states was about to be driven out of a 3rd. It had thousands of people to move across a continent, and property that had been gathered by the whole body could not simply become one family's inheritance because of a filing failure. From Emma's side, she had given this movement her father, her home, 6 children, 17 years, and every mile of the road, and she was now being asked to prove her entitlement to the house she was standing in. Neither of those is villainy. That is the tragedy of it. 2 exhausted parties, both right about something, arguing over an estate in the middle of a catastrophe. When most of the saints left for the Great Basin in 1846, Emma stayed. She kept the mansion house in Nauvoo, and she stayed there and raised her children. I have heard that framed my whole life as the moment she chose against the church. I think that is a poor reading, and here is why. Emma had already been driven out of New York, out of Ohio, out of Missouri. She had crossed a frozen river with children on her hip. She had buried 6 children in the ground of places she was then forced to leave. She was 41 years old. She had a newborn and no husband, and she was being asked to walk to a desert. You do not need apostasy to explain that decision. You need a map and a look at what the last 17 years had cost her. On the 23rd of December, 1847, she married Lewis Bidamon. He was not a member of the church. By every account, he was decent to her and to the children, and he was, for the first time in her adult life, a man whose commitments did not require her to move. In 1860, she joined the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the body that is known today as Community of Christ. Her son, Joseph Smith III, became its president at its founding that year, and her son Alexander served as a counselor. So she did not leave the faith. She went with the branch of it that her own children led, that stayed in the place her husband was buried, and that did not practice the thing that had nearly destroyed her marriage. Put like that, it stops being mysterious. Then, after her death, comes the hardest document in her life, and I am not going to duck it. In 1879, shortly before she died, Emma gave an interview to her sons. They published it afterward, and in it she appears to deny that Joseph ever practiced or sanctioned plural marriage at all. That statement is very difficult to reconcile with the documentary record, including with the fact that she personally witnessed 4 of those marriages in 1843. So what do we do with it? The uncharitable reading is that she lied at the end to protect her husband's name and her son's church. The charitable reading is that she was 74 years old, being interviewed by her own children about the worst thing that ever happened to her, and that the answer she gave was the answer a mother gives when the truth would cost her sons the ground they were standing on. There is a third reading that I find the most human of the 3, and it does not require her to be either a liar or a saint. It is that, after 35 years, Emma had built a version of her marriage that she could live inside, and she was not going to let 2 young men with a notebook take it apart in her front room. I do not know which is true. Anyone who tells you they know for certain is selling you something. What I notice is this. In that same period, at the very end, she also said the Book of Mormon was of divine authenticity, and that she had not the slightest doubt of it. She had every reason to walk away from all of it. Her father was proved right about the hardship. Her church had split. Her husband had been killed. She had been in a property fight with his successors. She had buried 6 children. And at the end she said, the book was true. You have to account for that. The critical story cannot account for that, and I would say gently that it usually just leaves it out. Emma Hale Smith Bidamon died on the 30th of April, 1879, in Nauvoo. She is buried beside Joseph. Here is what I think we owe her. She was not a saint in the flat sense. She resisted. She burned a revelation. She fought his successors in court over money. She spent her last decades in a different church than most of you watching this belong to, and she said things at the end that a great many faithful people find very hard to hear. And she was not an apostate. She kept the manuscript across the ice. She sat at the table and wrote the words down. She selected the hymns. She led the Relief Society. She buried 6 children on the road, and she said the book was true when there was nothing left to gain by saying it. She was a person. She loved a man who hurt her. She held a faith that cost her nearly everything. She made choices at 41 that a woman of 22 would not have understood. I have known people like this in my own family, and I suspect you have too. The relative whose story only makes sense if you are willing to hold 2 things at once, and whose memory gets fought over at funerals by people who each need her to have been one thing. The honest position on Emma is that she was faithful and she was wounded, and neither one cancels the other. The paper made it across the river. That is the image I keep. A woman in February, on ice, with a baby on her hip and a toddler holding her coat, and hundreds of pages of her husband's manuscript sewn into bags under her dress, walking toward Illinois because Missouri would not have her. Nobody made her carry the paper. She had 2 arms and 4 children, and there was not room. She decided the words were worth the weight. That is not the decision of a woman who was along for the ride, and it is not the decision of a woman who was ever, at any point, uncertain about what she had heard at that table. So here is what I would like from you, and I mean it as a real question rather than a prompt. Whose side of a hard family history have you had to learn to hold gently? Somebody in your family that the rest of them argue about. Somebody who did one thing that everyone remembers and 40 things that nobody does. Tell me about her or him down in the comments. I read them, and this is the episode where I expect the comments to be better than the video. And if you were taught only one Emma, either one, I would ask you to go and read her own letters before you take my word for any of this. She is more than capable of speaking for herself. She always was. That was rather the problem. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.